The flashing LED sketch was the first piece of code I attempted in the first tutorial of CT4013. It introduced me to the Arduino interface in quite a gentle fashion, introducing the declaration, setup and loop segments of the sketch together with a few basic commands. It was also my first attempt at modifying code. Changing the delay times to 3000 milliseconds and 50 milliseconds respectively enabled me to see the effect these changes had on the LED. The LED fade sketch introduced the aspect of applying a basic calculation to a variable in order to change the parameters of the variable. It also introduced the for loop, which was used to increase and decrease the fade value. By using increments of 5, this increased and then decreased the output to the LED, creating the fade effect. Again, the delay times were modified to see the effect these changes had on the LED. The SOS sketch expanded on the for loops introduced in the LED fade sketch, but this time using the ++ symbol to append to the existing value of the variable. The difference between the two for loops, the first one being repeated after the second one, is the long delay, keeping the output high for longer to create the SOS effect. Even though the traffic light sketch introduced more hardware and more variables, it was easier to code as it was quite simply a case of following a sequence of digital write and delay functions. So long as the status of the pins were changed to high or low in the correct order, with the same attention being paid to the delay times, it was relatively easy to simulate the sequence involved. The pedestrian crossing sketch was the first sketch to utilise a pin as an input. The green car and red pedestrian LEDs are set to high as part of the setup. Pressing the button changes its state to high and calls the change lights procedure. This sketch combines the logical sequence of instructions with a for loop. The lights changing is just a sequence of digital write functions together with delay functions. However, in order to reduce the amount of code used to make the green pedestrian LED flash, a for loop was used. This required 5 lines of code instead of the 20 it would have taken, which, in turn, would save the overhead on the memory required to store and run the code. The LED chaser sketch introduced arrays for the first time. An array is a method of saving code in the same fashion that a for loop can be used. The sketch also introduces the if statement. The if statement in this case is used to calculate the time between the changes in the LEDs. The direction in which the LEDs change will depend on the value of the variable direction. The final if statement in the sketch determines whether direction is a plus or -1, depending on whether the current LED is 0 or 9. The mood lamp sketch utilised a floating point array to handle any decimal points. The random seed function is used to generate the random numbers. The brightness of each colour of the RGB LED is dependent on the individual values between 0 and 255. These values are initially randomly generated and then calculated. The increments are calculated to increase the value and then randomly generated to reduce the value. The RGB rainbow sketch was easier to code than the mood lamp. It quite simply uses the RGB settings typed into the sketch and uses the set colour function. The only other function involved is to set the delay between the changes. The RGB controller sketch offers the user the ability to specify the individual RGB values. Serial communication is used to transfer the data from a serial monitor to the Arduino. This is because it is live data and not part of the compiled program loaded onto the board. The sketch also introduces the while loop, which is similar to the for loop, except that it will only execute while a certain condition is true. This was the most adventurous project that I attempted within this assignment, and I think it is a classic example of being able to learn to code following instructions without necessarily understanding all the aspects of those functions. But I also believe that this is part of the learning curve when learning new skills. The final sketch is for the fire effect. Again, it uses the random function to generate the values to be written to the pins, but as there are no RGB values involved, it was a much simpler project to code.